Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine matters which concern Guyanese both at home and in the diaspora. And this year, or this program, Public Interest, we'll be dealing with an event which has had a lingering impact on our entire country. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the accession of President Jagdeo to office. But it's also a time when we must examine what happened during what they call the Troubles. The Troubles were a human catastrophe, and it occurred, or the Troubles occurred because of the decisions and sometimes very dangerous decisions of the People's Progressive Administration, which had been in office from 1992 right up to 2015. And we all remember the constitutional fandango in August 1999 when Mr. Jagan decided to demit office, and a maneuver was put in place to prevent Mr. Hines from becoming president for the second time. He became president, of course, when Dr. Jagan died in 1997. And, you know, he was on the point of becoming president for the second time when a constitutional process was put in place. But the long and short of it is that within just about a little more than 2 years, we had two non-elected presidents, but the second non-elected president, I think, was able to preside over the worst spate of violence in this country, maybe the worst spate since the Demerara Revolt in 1823. I don't think there's any other time that we had so many murders, like between 2000 and 2015 or thereabouts, particularly during the tenure of President Jagdeo. This was a very troubling time, and that is why we call it the Troubles. And we must look carefully at what took place to ensure that we don't have that type of violence again. The violence has had an impact and continues to have an impact. When we speak of state violence, what do we mean? This is not just interpersonal violence or partner-on-partner violence or gang violence. When we speak of state violence, we speak of the behavior or the use of legitimate government authority to cause unnecessary harm and suffering to groups and individuals. So we're not speaking about a few rogues or bandits. We're speaking about the state itself, which causes unnecessary harm and suffering to its own citizens. And it is my view that state violence triggered the Troubles in this country. The Troubles are the name that we give to the decade of death, roughly between 2000 and 2010. This is how this millennium impacted on the Guyanese nation, that we came into the new century in almost in a state of violence. And it was a period when our people, the Guyanese people, endured the most murderous, the most merciful spate of violence that some of us would ever know. And we hope that we never again have to witness. We all remember, at least those of us who were old enough at the time, that on the 19th of February, the 9th of February 2000, those days, many of us did not have televisions, but those of us who had television would remember C.N. Sharma's television station televising the shooting to death. You can almost call it an execution of a wanted man. He was not a convict, he's not a criminal, he's wanted. His name was Lyndon London. And I think several senior police officers from the Army, the GDF at that time, and the police force were present. And London came out of the building that he was in, the Toucan Suite in Eccles, with his hands in the air. And he was shot down like a dog. And that basically, in my recollection, is really the start of the troubles. But there's a great build-up before then. But that incident, it sort of drained public confidence away from the criminal justice system. And it confirmed in people's mind what they had suspected years before, that extrajudicial killings, were being used by the state to get rid of people they didn't want to go before the courts or to give evidence. And the evidence was abundant at that time, because the United States Department of State reports every year on several events around the world, which of course can affect the interests of the United States. And one of them is called the Country Report on Human Rights Practices. And the United States Department of State Department, issued a report which referred repeatedly, year after year, even in the 1990s, to the arbitrary and unlawful deprivation of life. The arbitrary or unlawful deprivation of life. And it iterated the most significant abuses in Guyana included potentially unlawful killings by police. It continued, public investigations rarely are conducted into such killings, and police abuses continue to be committed with impunity. This was what the United States was reporting on Guyana nearly 30 years ago, during the 23-year PPP administration in this country. Unlawful deprivation of life. So there's evidence of state violence. In addition to that, the United Nations Human Rights Committee made 22 recommendations to the PPPC administration, including a call for prompt investigation by an impartial body into extrajudicial killings and the excessive use of force by the Guyana police force particularly. There was also a report by our own Guyana Human Rights Association, the GHRA. It's called Ambivalent About Violence, a report on fatal shootings by the police between 1980 and 2001. It examined police killings, and they found that the police killed 239 persons within that 21-year period. The police shot dead 229 persons in 21 years. And the PNC as well issued a report. Didn't call it a report, it's a little booklet called When the Young Die. And it listed many extrajudicial killings in Guyana between 1993, that is the year after the People's Progressive Party, Civic, entered the government, up to 2002, which is round about the start of the Troubles. So, my friends, there's evidence of the existence of this phenomenon, which I call state violence, that the United States was reporting on it, the local human rights association reporting on it, and political parties were reporting on state violence. It is not a fiction of someone's imagination. People were being killed, young boys were being killed, and they were not being investigated. The killings were not being investigated. So when we speak of the troubles, we have to look at the factors which caused the causative factors. We have to examine causation. We have to find why the troubles erupted in Guyana. And when we do that, we'll see that there was a long and gradual buildup of state violence, and that is an important factor. The troubles as a period of extreme violence was the consequence of several factors. It was not just one cause, not just bad guys and good guys, not just bandits and police, as we used to say long ago, police and thief. There was a buildup of state violence throughout the 1990s. Police killings continued to increase. And like in 1997 alone, police killed 27 persons. Was there. Every fortnight, police would kill somebody in that year. And there are many cases of assaults and brutality, deaths in police custody. And after a while, inevitably, the public started to distrust the police. And you'll see the consequences of that loss of confidence, the consequences of the distrust of the police force. Later on, maybe in future weeks, you continue to look at and pay attention to the public interest. And we will deal with the question of violence. It's very important that we eradicate or diminish the amount of violence in society, whether it's gang violence, domestic violence, interpersonal violence. We're looking at the roots of violence. And when you want to find what caused the violence taking place today, schools in our communities, let us go back to the troubles. And that's what we're dealing with now. There's also a question, my friends, about state failure. That is to say, the state, don't forget the PPP administration was in charge of the state at that time. And it failed to adhere to international conventions on human rights. It failed to adopt the countermeasures which were needed to prevent the biggest crime that was taking place in the country, which was narco trafficking. We must remember that prior to the PPP's entering office in 1992, the People's National Congress under Mr. Desmond Hoyt had promulgated a strategy for dealing with the drug problem. And he had actually established something called the National Drug Law Enforcement Committee. I can say this person because I was a member of the National Drug Law Enforcement Committee. And this NADLEC, as it was called, National Drug Law Enforcement Committee, was discarded by the PPP and the strategy for dealing with the drug problem. I think Mr. Colonel Fairbairn Liverpool was the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Home Affairs at the time, and he might have been responsible for drafting that strategy. And it was both the strategy and the committee were discarded by the PPP. The PPP administration failed to implement security sector reform, and it failed to permit the police force to perform its professional functions without interference or direction. And this is a serious problem. When elected ministers try to direct trained professionals in how they should carry out their duties, that is when the problems arise. And we will deal with that later. What we see, therefore, my friends, is that during the 1990s, the narco state, although we never fully became a narco state, the trend was that Guyana's moving towards narco statehood. And this trend emerged because of the importation of illegal narcotics and weapons into the country. Don't forget, it was under the PPP in October 1998 that right here in the Demerara Harbor, there was a St. Vincent registered ship called the MV Danielson. And from that ship, after a search was made, 3,000 kilos of cocaine, 3,000 kilos of cocaine. And by that time, in 1998, under President Janet Jagan, I think it became clear that Guyana was an important transit point. We don't produce coca, we don't produce cocaine, but we had cocaine and we had become a transshipment point for cocaine, which is produced in other countries. And we sent that cocaine to the United States, Canada, to Britain. And from 1998, with the embarkation of the law enforcement agencies on the MV Danielson, we realized that we had graduated to international narcotics statehood. Now, there were other factors which led us to be considered or be perceived in the international community as a narco state or as an emergent narco state. We suddenly found illegal airstrips being developed in the hinterland, planes landing, bringing in cocaine by the ton. This is not, some little, person with a pink suitcase. They were coming in by the plane load. So there had to be some official complicity, if not collaboration, with narco traffickers. Airstrips were being built in the hinterland to bring in planes from foreign countries laden with cocaine. So all of these factors point to official complicity or at least condonation of the state with criminal elements. And it was accompanied, of course, by the failure to arrest or punish traffickers. And one of the reasons was that even at that time, narco trade was contributing about 20% to the gross domestic product, probably more than sugar. Narco trade was contributing more than the sugar industry to the national economy. And that is probably one of the reasons why the PPP was so influential in allowing the narco trade or to prevent the narco trade from being completely suppressed. We also saw at that time that society was becoming extremely polarized. And there was post-election violence after the 1997 elections. As a result of that violence, there were certain accords, the Hurdmanson Accord, and there was a St. Lucia statement after the involvement of the Caribbean community. But in the following year, in 1999, that's after these statements were promulgated, and the St. Lucia Accord and Hurdmanson Accord, we did see a long strike by the GPSU. So again, those of you who have a historical memory, you can see that the confrontation between the public servants and the PPP is something that is, that has been with us for several decades. From the 1960s, I would say that easily for the last 60 years, there has been no love lost between the public servants and the PPP administration. And up to now, you can see that certain public servants, particularly civil servants, teachers, members of the discipline services, have had difficulties getting, fair salaries and wages out of the PPP administration. So the the GPSU strike in 1999, the 57-day strike in 1999, was also a time of very, very great unease. And you can remember how the security forces brutalized and treated many public servants who were, carrying out their legitimate constitutional right to protest against conditions that they felt were adverse. And the same thing is happening again, that the PPP administration fails to deal fairly with the large core of public employees in the public service, in the nursing profession, in the teaching profession, and in the security forces. So, in addition to that, we also had policy failures on the part of the Guyana police force. And this is essential to the question of public security. If the police force fails, or if the the officials in the police force don't conduct themselves in a professional manner, you can see the impact that it will have on society. And from the time the police force created a unit called the Target Special Squad, we realized that we were in for a very difficult time in terms of law enforcement. And this squad, which of course has been disbanded, was accused of detention of suspects without explanation. People just seized and detained without explanation. Some people were killed without investigation. Some people were injured, their houses searched and damaged without compensation. No explanation, no investigation, no compensation. And this was a time when you can see video recordings of police dragging suspects who they shot through the house, through the streets, in a most cruel and callous manner. The United Kingdom's Department of International Development, I think that has been absorbed in another ministry now in the United Kingdom. But even within a year after the resignation of Mrs. Jagan in 2000, a year after the United Kingdom's DFID, Department for International Development, had submitted proposals for the strategic reform of the Guyana police force. So it is not as though the international community didn't recognize what was happening. It's not as though the PPP administration did not receive advice repeatedly from experts in the United Kingdom. It is largely because these consultancies, this information, this advice was ignored by the PPP Civic. And what we saw happening is that not only was legitimate advice ignored, but we found that illegitimate death squads were being created. And all of this undermined confidence in the government. We will deal in future programs with the effect of ignoring the advice of experts on security sector reform. We can now look again briefly at the question of narco trafficking and narco terrorism. Once there's excessive, or once there's importation of cocaine on the scale, the industrial scale we saw cocaine being imported into this country, there will be violence. Once there's cocaine importation, there'll be gun running. People will use the guns, the traffickers will use the guns, not only to protect their enterprises, but to expand the enterprises into other territories. And people will die. People will die, and there will be drug gang warfare. And that was the name coined by a former, now deceased, head of the presidential secretariat. Many people never heard it before he uttered it at the press conference. Drug gang warfare. And this is what happened after the narco traffickers started to take control of Guyanese society. Now, the People's Progressive Party civic administration discarded our national strategy for dealing with the drug problem. It dissolved the National Drug Law Enforcement Committee, which the PNC administration had set up. And it set up its own Kanun with 2 or 3 dozen persons there in the middle of the 1990s, but never had the capability of preventing drug trafficking. Drugs are an international issue. It's coming across the border, planes were landing in different parts of Ghana. Kanun never had the resources, it never had the personnel, it never had the vehicles, it never had drones, it never had the aircraft. So it was confined to, collecting, going up 1 or 2 rivers and collecting a few kilos of marijuana. But it has never been able to prevent massive influx of cocaine into this country or export of cocaine. And we'll look at that narco trafficking in more detail at some other time. But Kanu never had the capability. I don't know if he even had the interest of preventing drug trafficking into this country or exports from this country. In addition to that, the United States Department of State publishes something called, in addition to its human rights report, it publishes International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, the INCSR, every year. And it speaks of the arrests of immigration officers, of customs officers. So you can see that officialdom was being corrupted by the narco trade. And when persons, and especially in the 1990s, were arrested, many cases were dismissed. And sometimes, cases were not brought before the courts. Many drug traffickers escaped until, of course, they made the mistake to go into another jurisdiction. And this is what happened when one notorious drug trafficker went over to Suriname to conduct his business. And the present president of Suriname, Chandrika Prasad Santoki, was I think, the police chief at that time. And he ended up in a correctional facility in the United States. But in Guyana, he was walking around the streets, with his guns and bodyguards, as free as a bird, until he went to a properly run jurisdiction in Suriname. We therefore now look quickly and briefly at the question of state violence. Several factors contributed to narco trafficking and to the birth of drug gangs. Yes, there was competition among the gangs, there was killing, there was corruption of officials, there was criminalization of certain communities, and there was the creation of crime cartels. And these cartels had to deal with the transnational crime of narco trafficking. It's not a local crime because we don't produce cocaine. Cocaine had to come into the country. People had to negotiate and make deals with international suppliers, and they had to send it to certain destinations. They had to bring in weapons. So narcotics was never a victimless crime. The impact could be seen in the amount of people who were killed during the Troubles. And narcotics spread into different communities, and it affected and contaminated and corrupted certain elements in officialdom, particularly the law enforcement agencies. It spread its tentacles into many communities, particularly through the use of bribery and terror. We therefore see that state violence was the major contributor to the Troubles. The role of the state cannot be erased from the legacy of death and destruction that occurred in this country during the Troubles. Hundreds of persons were killed. Nobody could ever account for the amount of people who were killed. But it was the attitude of the PPP civic administration which permitted judicial, extrajudicial killings, particularly by rogue policemen, not the entire police force. And this was a time when one person was commissioner of police for 11 years. And after he had passed retirement age, he was given extensions. So this meant that his juniors were retiring before him. And this is one of the factors which led to the demoralization of the police force. And it's happening again. When certain senior officers are due to retire, they are given extensions of service. So many younger officers who were expected to be promoted with the effluxion of time were being forced into retirement before their older senior officers. It's happening again. So the PPP's attitude to the police and the police misbehavior, especially from certain police officers, was a major contributor to the incapacity of the force. The PPP's neglect of advice which was coming from the United Kingdom DFID, Department of International Development. And when I entered office, I don't want to get ahead of the subject matter, but when I entered office in 2015, we had to invite the United Kingdom to come back and reestablish the Security Sector Reform Action Plan, which the PPP had discarded. So we saw the impact on the criminal justice system. We saw the impact of PPP political interference in the professional management of the police force. We saw the impact of the decisions of the PPP not to implement reasonable remedial measures to correct the deficiencies and the mistakes being committed by the Guyana police force. And this is why state violence was a major contributor to what we now know as the Troubles. And this is why we say that state violence opened Guyana, exposed Guyana to the murders and the massacres which occurred during the era of Mr. Jagdeo's tenure as president of Guyana between 1999 and 2011. And it's our hope that even as we observe this 25th anniversary of the PPP's constitutional fandango, we do not forget the lessons of the Troubles, and we do not lead Guyana into that type of murderous era that we saw, that we all had to endure during the early decades of this century and the last decade of the previous century. Thank you, and may God bless you and your children.
Let us cooperate for Guyana. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can. Each man